I'd like to start with a confession. I am an Israel education geek. It's very sad. I am that kind of person who actually stays up at night and thinks about Israel education. Thankfully, I work at Makom, the Israel Education Lab of the Jewish Agency, which means I have colleagues who are likewise geeky like me. And you need to pity us, because it's not easy being an Israel education geek these days. Because as you know, Israel is really complicated. There's stuff that everybody's shouting about that isn't actually happening. There's stuff that's happening that no one's talking about. You've got the left, the right, the religious, the secular, the Muslims, the Palestinians, the Jews. It's really complicated. And yet, whenever I begin a conversation with someone starting with those words, it's really complicated, suddenly eyes glaze over and no one's listening. Because to be an Israel education geek, you have to somehow sum up in a simple way how to grasp how complicated things are, which is not an easy job, even if you have all the time in the world, because you can't talk about Israel without talking politics, which are everywhere, but at the same time, you don't want to spend too much time talking about politics because you miss the fun of everything else. We have to find a way not to bypass politics, but also not make them the destination. And the final reason that you have to take pity on me as the Israel education geek is that I have no friends. I have no friends because, strangely enough, there are very few people who are willing to spend all night talking about Borochov's inverted pyramid in the speech that he gave in 1917 about socialist Zionism. It turns out that some of my friends are Jewish, and many of them turn out to be Zionists, but apparently most of them are mainly human beings, and they would prefer to be talked to as human beings, rather than as some kind of weird Israel education geek. So me and my geeky friends at Makom started to think, what would happen if we left Israel aside for a second and thought about the world? What is going on with human beings around the world that is also complicated and that is also interwoven with politics? And if we can find a way of making sense of what's going on throughout the world, maybe we'll be able to make use of that understanding to apply it to what goes on in Israel as well. So what's going on in the world? Well, lots of fun stuff. Climate change is affecting and concerning many human beings throughout the world. It seems that every time the West intervenes militarily in the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, awful things tend to happen. And yet at the same time, looking at Syria, when the West does not intervene militarily in the Middle East, awful things tend to happen too. And Syria is only about an hour's drive from where I live, so that keeps me up at night. We've got issues of freedom of speech. We all remember Charlie Hebdo. Can I say what I want to say? Can I say what I want without being in danger of vilification or even murder? And am I now even free to go to a cafe or a club without being in danger of the terror that's spreading from the Middle East and Africa across the Western world? More fun stuff. This is one of the most beautiful and disturbing photos that's emerged in recent times. It's a photograph of refugees on their way to Australia, Europe, Florida. They're leaving a dangerous place in a very dangerous fashion on their way to a very insecure future. And the growing gaps between rich and poor. I don't know whether as a father I'm more worried my kids might turn out to be the guy sitting on the steps or the women standing for the photograph. So with all this fun stuff going on, working through this litany of woes, we started noticing that all these issues have 4 fundamental questions in common. They all raise the same 4 questions, yet answer them differently. First question is, how can we be safe? How do we make sure that we're not going to be shot at or blown up or mown down in the streets? Second question is, who are we? What do we do As in, who are we Americans, we Brits, we Canadians, we Australians? How do we treat other Americans? How should we treat people who are not American? Third question, how can we be free, democratic, independent in this interdependent world? And finally, less trendy but growing ever more relevant, how do we relate to our land? Is our land only for us, or should we open it up to others, to refugees from other lands? How many and when? Let's for a second just focus on the example of climate change. But there are times I wake up in the winter and it's a beautiful, warm, sunny day and I say, thank God for global warming. And other times I say, oh my God, we're all going to die. We're all going to be burnt to a crisp in desert wastelands. There are other times I say, I'm okay, we've got the composter, the permaculture cucumbers and cauliflowers, all's going to be fine. But there are other times when I think this isn't ever going to be solved locally. We need to just get rid of countries altogether and tackle this issue globally. But then we're never going to be able to tell the Chinese what to do, and they're still burning their coal. But on the other hand, I totally understand them because I want to be able to drive my gas-guzzling car, and anyway, I can't afford a Prius. 4 questions. Many different answers, even in one person's head. So what we started saying to ourselves was, if these are 4 questions that are relevant to us all as human beings, it may be that they are relevant to Israel too. And as it turns out, the penultimate line of Hatikvah, the Israeli national anthem, pretty much manages to sum up these 4 questions in one line. Liot am chofshi be'artzenu, to be a people free in our land. These 4 Hebrew words pretty neatly map onto these 4 questions. To be is about life and staying alive. People is about us, collective identity and collective behaviour. Freedom and in our land. These are the 4 key questions that we've been talking about. And they're summed up in this line, which often can be seen to be an aspiration for many peoples, not just us, the people of Israel. For example, the Kurds. The Kurds are fighting to be the Kurdish people free in the land of Kurdistan. The Catalonians, the Quebecois, the Scots had the choice to become the Scottish people free in the land of Scotland, and they chose not to, or at least as of August 2016 when we're recording. We can also see that the Palestinians would say that they are struggling to be the Palestinian people free in the land of Palestine. And we, the people of Israel, wish to continue to be the people of Israel free in the land of Israel. And here, already, we've summed up the beginning of the conflict. We have one piece of geography which Palestinians see as their land and which we see as our land. And so quite naturally, these questions begin to arise. We're not asking whether we're a free people in our land or whether we should be. We're actually asking how. How should we be? How can we ensure that we're secure, that we fight only as much as we need to and can enjoy life as much as we can? How should being Jewish play out in this country? Where should our religion and our faith fit into what happens in this place? How should our understandings of solidarity affect the way that Israel behaves? Our approach to Jewish values, tikkun olam, looking after the rest of the world, not only the Jewish world. How should that affect Israel's policies in the world? These are questions of how. How should we be democratic? How can our independence play out in the Middle East? And finally, how do we understand what our land is? How is it our land? How do we assert its borders? Which borders? So we reckon that these 4 questions are a useful way of understanding complex Israel issues. Because all we need to do is ask, what are this person's answers to these 4 questions? So for example, the conflict with the Palestinians. Here's a cartoon, created by a great artist by the name of Shai Charka. It's just a cartoon. It's not necessarily supposed to be realistic. It might even be more simple than we think. But we see that it's still more complicated than we might expect. There are two guys here. Sitting on the right is Charter. Charter is an Israeli Orthodox Jewish man who's sitting having a coffee in an area that he would call Judea and Samaria. On the left is Ahmed, a Muslim Palestinian having a coffee with his friend in an area that he would call the West Bank or occupied Palestine. And says Ahmed, "How is it that we can sit here drinking coffee together when our two nations can't stop fighting each other?" And Charter says, "Wow, man." And Ahmed says, "It's all because of politics. If we were in charge, there'd be peace here already." And then Ahmed gives us his vision of peace. He says, "If I were in charge, I'd bring you all into Islam, and we'd live here like brothers." And Charter's vision of peace, he says, "And I'd give Jordan to you guys, so you could turn it into a democratic Palestinian state like you learnt from us." Sums up Ahmed, "Check it out. There could have already been peace." Wow, man. Now this is a cartoon, which we might expect to be somewhat simple, but here they are giving us a vision of peace, seemingly agreeing with each other, when they both of them have totally opposing views of what peace should be. Both of their views about peace are thoroughly incompatible. They don't agree with each other, and yet if ever we wanted to reach a vision of peace, it's the Jew and the Arab sitting having a coffee and a ciggy in the countryside. How can we make sense of this? Let's check out how each of them is answering the questions. So Ahmed says, "If I were in charge, I'd bring you all into Islam and we'd live here happily ever after." So he's saying you can't be Jewish, free, here. He's offering up 3 out of 4. And by the same token, Charter is saying you can be a Palestinian state, you can be a free democratic state, just not here. You also get 3 out of 4. And of course we know that there are other people in the real world, for example Tzipi Livni, who talks about the two-state solution. She's talking about the requirement to divide up parts of the land. She's suggesting we both of us need to be 2 separate peoples, democratic, but that we need to divide the land in a certain way. Others from the other side, for example the late Edward Said, suggest that collective identity should not be part of the conversation. We can be democratic in this place while ignoring the people stuff. Different answers to the same 4 questions in order to make a little bit more sense out of this complex situation. And this understanding of these 4 Hatikva questions, 4HQ, the 4 Hatikva questions, having this 4HQ chip ready to slip into my learner's head somehow allows this geek to sleep a little better at night. Because I have a feeling that 4HQ, these 4 Hatikva questions, do give me a handle on how to simply communicate how complicated this place is, without ignoring the politics or getting bogged down in them, and somehow speaking to human questions as well as Jewish questions. 4HQ also allows us to assess our own biases. If we lean to the left, we'll probably find ourselves emphasizing questions of freedom and putting to one side questions of security. And likewise, if we lean rightwards, we'll emphasize security and worry less about freedom. So, at Makom, we don't advocate for any particular answers, but we do recommend pushing ourselves always to try to ask all 4 questions. And as we continue to learn about Israel, looking around Israel, it's worthwhile looking through the lens of these 4 Hatikva questions. How are these questions being answered? Where might the answers be celebrated and where should they be challenged? Always looking out to ask, have we got the best answer to this one? Have we got it absolutely right? Or has this answer lost its pertinence and needs to be updated according to changing circumstances. Asking ourselves these 4 questions is, I would suggest, what is at the root of being a Zionist. Because to be a Zionist is to strive to find ever better answers to these 4 Hatikvah questions.